family. This is Davon Love, Director of Public Policy, Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle. Welcome again to A Search of Black Power. I want to introduce our guest, Ernest Shaw, renowned muralist, artist in Baltimore City. Ernest, thanks for taking your time out to be with us today.
Pleasure to be here.
All right, man, let's jump right into it. And this will be an interesting conversation because normally in these conversations we talk a lot about like the larger, political currents and, a lot of it relating to the work that we do. Mm-hmm. And, one of the projects that we work on, the Black Arts District, Lady Breon, who's part of the LBS team that's working on that. And for me, this is an opportunity to really expand on like the real material political implications that art has on our struggle for Black liberation, and really, I don't know if there's a better person to talk about that, particularly in the Baltimore context than you. So let's just start with some basics. If you could just talk about your artwork and kind of wrap into that how it reflects your politics so that the audience get a sense of like your own politics.
So in addition to being an artist, I'm also an educator. And I like to title myself an artist educator, not an art educator, because the two practices is actually one practice for me. So my work can be labeled as portraiture. I don't necessarily consider it that, but very figurative, realistic, but moving slightly more toward abstraction. The more I incorporate aspects of traditional African, or what can be defined as traditional African art, sculptures, masks, things of that nature, motifs, it's becoming more abstract. As far as it being a reflection or illustration of my politics, I was born late 60s. Remember vividly what it's like living just off of Pennsylvania Avenue, growing up in the 70s. Moving to Edmondson Village, growing up as a teenager in the 80s, being what is I would consider part of the hip-hop generation, technically. But Baltimore was interesting, West Baltimore especially. I had parents, I grew up in a two-parent household, and though they weren't outwardly political, they were a direct reflection of the times. Both my parents had afros. They wore dashikis. They wore certain necklaces that had an African aesthetic. And they lived in a way, now that I'm older and know a little more, I would say they lived in a way that was, to me, very African or West African in many ways. But the 70s was a different, late 60s, 70s was a much different time than now. So on the wall of my parents' apartment was portraits of African people. Created by an artist that literally lived across the street. His name was Kaki, or I believe his government name, as the kids would say, was Robert McQueen, but he was known throughout the community as Kaki. He also participated in Park Vibe. Every Sunday, Drew Hill Park. That was something that my family went to, so the Park Vibe, the drumming, things like that. So this is a part of my upbringing. So if aesthetically visually I'm seeing portraits of African women and children on the walls, not photos, but pastel and charcoal drawings and paintings. And then I would grow up to be what could be considered I define myself as an image maker, not necessarily an artist, but the images that I produce are very similar to the images that I saw at a very early age. I would say I am a byproduct of the Black Arts Movement and the Black Power movement, so to speak. Because the aesthetic, the artists of that time would also go on to become my educator, my teachers, literally, not just figuratively speaking. Carol Bayard was my drawing teacher and head of the art department at Baltimore School for the Arts. Now, that could be considered an Anglo-Euro-Western academic institution, but if she's my drawing teacher and she was the illustrator of the children's book Cornrows, which was very African-centered, you know what I mean? Then we already know what her politics are, and that had an impact on me. Angela Franklin was my professor of African-American art history at Morgan State University. Again, another Black woman who had a politic that was more global relative to Black people and Africana people than one might expect. And those are just two, of many. And those were teachers and institutions, but there were, I'm cocky, there were a number of artists throughout the community whose work I look to that would go on to have an impact on my work. My work has grown to reflect the humanity of my subjects by attempting to, in some way, develop a relationship with the humanity of the viewer. So that could be a viewer from anywhere. Now, I do make it clear, similar to the artist, Arthur Jafer, right? Author, filmmaker, multidisciplinary artist, who states that his work is in conversation with Black people specifically. Doesn't mean other people can't listen in on the conversation, if that makes sense. But centered in his work is a conversation with people who can be defined as Black. So when I'm doing portraits, mostly of African people or people who can be defined as Black, my dialogue with them is in illustrating a humanity that has always been there, even a humanity that is defined differently than the definition that the overwhelming majority of people will come to know, and probably the only definition of humanity that most of us understand is that has come out of Europe. So my audience, my dialogue is with those subjects.
Mm-hmm. So you already kind of touched on the Black Arts Movement, and you talked about it synonymous with the Black Power movement. And so you talked a little bit already about its impact on your work. If you can talk a little bit more, both in terms of your own work and maybe your sense of the artist landscape and terrain, because one of the things that I understand about the Black Arts Movement was that it was about refashioning a vision of humanity that wasn't rooted in kind of the Western colonial frame that dehumanizes people of African descent. It's interesting to hear you say a part of what you do in dialogue with Black people is, in dialogue in such a way to assert the humanity of the subjects, that you render. So if you could talk about the impact of the Black Arts Movement, both on your work, kind of as you already started to get to, and as you see it in the broader landscape, just to, as an artist overall.
So, not to continue to give examples that come out of Europe, however, but specifically as a muralist, I like to give this reference. And we all know late 15th century, late 1400s, what one might call age of exploration, Renaissance, or whatever. Enlightenment. Michelangelo was commissioned to paint the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. Some of that imagery, as Europe would begin to explore, in air quotes, right? That imagery was taken with them. Anywhere you go around the world, there are most of the places that were colonized, you will find images of the deity, supreme deity, that look like European people. So that ceiling of the Sistine Chapel is a mural with a depiction of what could be considered God, right? Not just God, Adam, Eve, things of that nature. It's through those images that, even to this day, if you mention God, folks think images like Zeus, even if their reference is biblical. Gandalf, you know what I mean? Father Time, Saint Nick, like it's all the same image aesthetically. So if that painting, Ceiling Sistine Chapel, or painting similar to that, can have the impact it has had on the world, as an artist, I'm coming to understand what my role or what power I could have as a image maker, again, going back to that term, image maker. So when I'm creating murals, I'm trying to collectively have an impact on the conscience of those who will see that, who are in mostly close proximity to that. So the overwhelming majority of my work, you'll find in places that could be considered the hood, you know what I mean? Or, places where you may see what could be defined as blight. So my goal is to, again, in conversation with those people, to highlight the beauty that already exists there prior to the mural coming. Because murals are also often used as tools for gentrification, right? That we know. But my goal is to, one, highlight the humanity and the beauty that already existed in those places, regardless of whatever blight you may see as defined as blight. But secondly, again, I have had other professors like James Phillips, like, folks who really created an aesthetic that, in my opinion, was not new. Like there's this myth or this belief that, and I had a debate with one of my professors at Morgan State, Professor Sarah Caberhan. He was from Eritrea. And his belief was that the African American was not African. They were something new. Now, I don't think he was attempting to be condescending, because his thing was, you are something new and different. And he would reference like James Brown, like some of the the artists that have created something new. In my opinion, it was, we're not new. It's African. Well, Africa is a continent, right? Hundreds of different ethnicities, nations of people, language, customs. This is just what has come to be known as a Black American. I'm not going to say African American, because that's different. But what has come to be known as a Black American is just one child of Africa, not separate from.
Right.
You know what I mean? So when we talking the role of the artist and what my role is, it's to highlight, reveal some of those ways in which we continue to practice traditional African culture. Sometimes doing it subliminally, or doing it in not saying that's what I'm doing, like putting certain images in my work. I more than often start with some type of African motif or sculpture. But I do it in a way where if you know it, you see it. If you're familiar with that iconography. But if you're not familiar with it, you won't be offended by it, because you won't even know that's a design. I specifically did that on Pennsylvania North Avenue. There's a silhouette of a Nimba mask from the Baga people of coastal Guinea, which represents not the holy feminine, but that which, and I'm trying to speak in terms that folks would understand, but feminine energy, so to speak, right? So that's the very first thing. If you know it, you see it. If not, you're not offended by it. And I do that intentionally because of, out of respect for those who may not have.
So in connecting it to the Black Arts Movement, because I imagine when we talk about the borrowing of the cultural resources of people of African descent, then in a lot of ways, like what you just described, like your methodology of weaving in traditional African culture, in some ways is one can trace the genealogy of that method in some ways to the Black Arts Movement. Would you
Absolutely. Not only that, if we were to have a conversation about children's names, and my students now, I've been teaching for 20 years. I have a 9th grade class. First day of school, I and it's mostly young ladies, but it's not solely young ladies. I say, raise your hand if your name ends in a vowel sound, right? And then you get the names, right? It used to be a running joke when I was younger. You see stuff like Shanae, Bonquisha, like it was you know how we do anti-Black, anti-African. But the overwhelming majority of young ladies phonetically still have names. That's a direct impact of the Black Arts and Black Power movement. Because my name is Ernest. I'm a junior. But I come from a generation where the majority of our names were, we were juniors, or they're European in origin. But because of the Black Arts and Black Power movement, language was developed and understanding culturally of who we are, different ways of knowing and being, then you still see remnants of that. You know what I mean? In ways that go unnoticed. Because when their parents named them that, I'm sure they weren't thinking anything relative to anything cultural, anything related to traditional African culture. It's just part of what we do, But it's a direct impact or reflection of what was done during that Black Arts and Black Power movement. Decentering an Anglo-Euro way of knowing and being in ways that hadn't been done previously, at least not in mass.
So when we think about, the struggle for Black liberation, and we think about, and again, I kind of, as I mentioned at the top, a lot of times I don't know that there is a defined, in the mainstream, not a defined sense of what the role is of art and the role that it has played or it can play in terms of Black liberation. Could you speak a little bit to the ways that you've seen Black art, particularly art that has its genealogy, that you would describe its method and worldview as kind of an extension of the Black arts movement, the politics represented by it, Black Power, African Center, all those. What are some ways that you've seen art contribute to the politics of Black liberation?
Contemporary?
Or historical, either one.
So I'll try to give reference to a few things that's more contemporary, right? If you look at the murals and shrines that were created after George Floyd's death, and not only George Floyd, you see him when Kobe passed. You know what I mean? We'll be talking about mainstream, but specifically things like George Floyd or Breonna Taylor, like with some of the artwork that was created as a part of that movement, right? I don't use the term, I often don't reference Black Lives Matter movement. I see Black Lives Matter as a part of a continuous movement for Black liberation, right? So I don't focus solely on that. But as a part of a continuous struggle for Black liberation, there's this, and it's not new, but there is always this battle between what's going on commercially and what's going on, I guess, what you could define as grassroots. So you have artists making contributions like, let's say Kendrick Lamar, because I'm not just going to talk about visual art. And his visual representation on one of those award shows where he had a silhouette of Africa with Compton in it, as if Compton was a part of that. Like that alone, if you know what you're looking at, it reveals that there's something there, right? It reveals that there's something there. And then to come out in that performance in chains, right? In what could be considered prison, and then transition to traditional African drum and dance, like there's a lot there. That's one example. But it's difficult, part of it, to answer your question, is difficult because a lot is so commercial now. Because even that performance was on an award show on national TV. You know what I mean? So it's kind of like part of what I think Sylvia Winter talks about in Mistaking the Map for the Territory is that would have never happened during the Black Arts Movement. You know what I mean? You would have never seen that type of relationship between what Amiri Barak and the folks had plays on street corners. Like you could go to some parts of Harlem and there'd be a play here, a dance performance there. Philip Burgess, who we work with. Professor, for a time he was a professor of theater at Morgan. I'm on Pennsylvania North Avenue in a cherry picker in a lift, painting that in 2015, painting that mural. And across the street, they're doing a performance on a makeshift stage, right? A musical theater performance while I'm painting. That to me is a byproduct of the Black Arts Movement. You would have never, on Pennsylvania and North Avenue, right, where the people are. A lot of people don't even know that happened. Right. So that to me, that's the most real, not taking away what Kendrick did. But again, there is that's because I loved that performance, that Kendrick Lamar. That's the closest thing I could, as far as something that happened in the mainstream, that I could reach out and touch to say, okay, there's something there. But,
and to go a little deeper on that, because that piece around the having Black arts that reference African culture, that reference our struggle for liberation in mainstream spaces, commercial spaces. And one of the things you just said was that the experience you had of doing a mural while there was a performance happening as a byproduct of the Black Arts Movement, and that's something that isn't shared widely. And so I feel like that's one of those dilemmas, right, where it's like people, there's like going towards commercial success and whether or not trying to infuse some of the tenets of the Black Arts Movement, and that is effective versus, again, what you described, the painting and theater in 2015. Now, I would argue that a big part of the challenge is that, how do we actually get to our community and build a base that's connected to formations, to organizations, to individuals that really have a commitment for Black freedom and sovereignty. You know what I'm saying? And so when I think about the value of what you described, that experience in 2015, like to me, that's like you're getting directly to people that traditionally, in those mainstream spaces may not experience it in that way. But also there's a sacrifice that comes along with that. So just going a little deeper on this question around the role of art in Black liberation, because I think this dilemma is mirrored in political conversations, right? It's mirrored in terms of, do you try to, impose yourself on the Democratic Party, right? Or do you try to build something different? Do you see that dilemma reflected, in terms of artists that take a position that you take, you know what I'm saying, versus those who may not take that position?
We've had sort of you asked a similar question, I think, at UB Blake. Right?
Yeah.
So, again, I struggle with the question because it's almost living under a capitalist regime. There's no compromise. There's no negotiating with capitalism, right? It's never going to produce or highlight something that's going to assist in its destruction. That's just not how it works. So, and Sylvia Winter makes reference kind of to what happened to the Black arts, Black aesthetic, and Black power movement, Black studies. What happened to Black studies? That Black studies movement, which happened at the same time. To me, it's all a part of one energy and time. How Black studies was consumed by academia in ways where it could continue to exist, but it had to. Now, I don't want to use the word evolve. It was tainted, and it became African American studies. And we don't have time to go into even the change. The language tells you exactly what it, ethnic studies, and then it go on to it. But so it's almost impossible to have the impact you want. Largely, though, because it's almost like time doesn't stop. Like the system that's oppressing folk doesn't stop to allow you to get your plan together and to begin to dismantle it. While you are putting together a plan and then working to dismantle and undo and counter, that momentum's still growing. So since the compromising of the Black arts and Black power movement, I would say there are, because let's be clear, the folks that participated in that movement was a small percentage of the community we define as Black. It wasn't the entire community, The people who participated in the civil rights movement, it wasn't an overwhelming percentage of Black folk. So my argument is that as time, the farther removed we are, that number shrinks. So now that number of people who are concerned with Black liberation, who study, who read, who watch the documentaries, who day to day create organizations that work relative to Black liberation, not only does that number shrink, what we come to understand Black liberation changes. So you have people who, and I want to be clear when I say this, who view LeBron James as a revolutionary. You know what I mean? Now, let me be clear. LeBron James does some work, right? LeBron James is working toward helping folk. He's doing a lot more than a lot of other folk. But that's not revolutionary. that may be liberatory for some, again, for some, but it's not revolutionary. But when that becomes your definition of someone who fights for justice, and then what is possible, what the reality, what the outcome can be changes. You know what I mean? Organizations like Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle, those organizations become few and far between. You know, or that number of organizations.
So let's get into, because you kind of started in on the attacks on the Black Arts Movement, which I would argue, and LBS has argued in a variety of places, that Black nationalism or Pan-Africanism as bodies of work, as a political worldview, have been approaches that mainstream, particularly leftist and progressive movements, have sought to water down. And you mentioned Sylvia Winters and the piece "Mistaking the Map for the Territory," which I shared with you months ago, and for me a brilliant piece, and a part of what Sylvia Winters, who was a Jamaican playwright, scholar, and academic, and was very proximate to a lot of the liberation movements that happened during that the 60s and 70s. And a part of what is beautiful about her argument in that piece is that she describes very clearly the attacks on the Black Arts Movement in its commitment to Black nationalism, its commitment to Black self-determination as a primary mode of politics, but also in identifying the fact that a part of what the Black Arts Movement did, we think about European domination of the world and colonialism. And as Dr. Clark, once said, colonization wasn't just about colonizing particular land and territory, but colonizing information about the world. And so we think about the Black Arts Movement as providing some of the conceptual frame and meaning making that could shift the way in which Europeans have been able to define what is humanity, and arts being a central, essential place with that. And she talks about the ways in which it's been absorbed into kind of a post-structuralist, liberal, multicultural frame that creates distance between, the fight for Black self-determination, nationhood, cultural autonomy, distance between that, in a way that, to the point that you made a few moments ago, now Black liberation becomes just merely Black inclusion into the white mainstream. You know what I mean? And I know one of the things that I find particularly difficult in the political advocacy space is that you have a lot of folks that are talking about social justice, right? But they're talking about it from a broad political frame that's caught up in that liberal multicultural frame that Winters is criticizing, that essentially in many ways is an attack against Black nationalism, and Black Arts Movement being central to that. So I've kind of described what it briefly what it looks like in the advocacy space. Can you say a little bit about what that looks like? And you kind of did a little bit, like what it looks like as a artist who is committed to the politics of Black liberation, African centered, Black nationalist. How is that dynamic of the distance something that you observe as an artist?
I'm gonna try to answer that question. It's a lot there, right? But I first like to, again, to clarify, artists are, as I come to understand, as I was taught, artists are simply the tips of the spear in any movement. Artists are just the flicker to the flame. Like it's just we just spark. So understanding that, to try and answer your question, is difficult because then for me, I'll speak for me personally, is what does it mean? Because definitions of what it means to be Black. Now we got to talk about what does it mean to be Black, what does it mean to be African. When you say Black art, what is Black art? Because I'll give this example. Sister Soldier's Coldest Winter Ever, right? Yeah. When she wrote that. It was seminal, her seminal work, right? What came after that? Similar in film, let's say Boys in the Hood. What came after Boys in the Hood? The work, what I would say, work that was less authentic, less sincere, work that cookie cutter, sort of following the success of a Boys in the Hood or a Coldest Winter Ever. And I'm talking specifically about that because those were centered in urban black. So when you use work like that, what often comes after is kind of what happened to the Black arts movement, right? It's this, the social structure is going to create a thing. It's going to seek to consume it as a means of defeating it, if that makes sense. What I found, and I know this might sound all over the place, but what I found interesting about her work was difficult. Winter's work was difficult about my job is that I'm working with a paradigm of thinking that my audience has no idea exists, right? And I liken that to the fight for Black liberation. There are much less folks that have any idea that even the definition of what it means to be human, was created by the same individuals that's committed the most inhumane acts around the globe historically.
And I would even add, even know that contesting for that matters and knowing why contesting for that would even matter.
Absolutely. So those are the same individuals that gave me my definition of art. The term art, what it means. Art is used by the Academy the same way, let's say Egyptology is used relative to the history of Kemet, right? Art is used in the same way. So I have to have knowledge of that as an artist, right? I have to have knowledge of the fact that what I create can't be for my own self-aggrandizement. And this probably might lead to one of your later questions. I know that what I create, once it's put out there in the universe, I have no control over who consumes it, or especially now with the technology. We're in a totally different situation than they were in the Black Arts Movement because they didn't have the technology that we had. If we did, I think we'd be in a different space.
And let me just add quickly, because I think, a part of, like, when I think about, like, the work you do and the perspective that you operate from, and I think about the larger context of Baltimore City, I would say that I would find the politics that you represent in the minority.
Yeah.
And I imagine that there are folks who may see themselves as aligned with your perspective. You know what I mean? But I'm sure that there are ways in which, like you said, they don't even understand the kind of deeper political contestation that you're engaged in terms of the commitments that you've made ideologically and politically to Black liberation. You know what I mean? And I guess and I'll use an example. Like, I know, for instance, like in the work that I'm doing in the political space, I know that there are still Black folks who, when it comes to thinking about what's best for Black people, they're still trapped in the European imagination so much that the solutions they come up with often are solutions that require us to petition white folks, right, to intervene in our affairs. The term that we use, disaster management, right, where it's like, we need white folks and their institutions to do more for our community in the name of equity. And so when we come into this space, we're like, no, we just need the civilizational machinery, the infrastructure for us to practice our own freedom and fulfilling our own needs. And that's something that conceptually for a lot of people is very difficult because all they know is petitioning white folks for our freedom. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And I imagine similarly, there are folks who would see themselves as social justice minded, but in terms of the worldview, right, still playing in that notion of humanity that Winters is talking about.
So many folks can't even conceive a world outside of capitalism. And capitalism is not practiced all over the world, right? But I got into a debate with an artist, friendly debate, at a house room full of artists, filmmakers, you know what I mean? But the younger folk can't even conceive a world that doesn't operate relative to a capitalist, mandate. So how do how do you navigate that? Like, how do you? Because I'm older now. I'm 50 plus. How do I simultaneously seek to be successful as an image maker, as an artist, however success is defined, while thinking as a collectivist first? Because I don't use the word communist. I don't use the word Marxist, socialist. I'm a collectivist, right? I'm only an individual in my work as an artist. I'm only an individual relative to my relationship to my community, right? But when you are operating in a space where you have younger artists in the city of Baltimore who aren't even aware that there is a reality that can exist outside of an individualist sort of quest for financial success, right? Which is not something I look down upon, right? Because I also recognize that some of our elders and ancestors, their ancestors now, took a vow of poverty. They equated the struggle with poverty.
Right.
And if the ones that are still around might argue that that was, considering knowing what we know now, that might have been a mistake, right? If I hear your question correctly, how do I navigate creating the work that I create, teaching what I teach in my classroom, maintaining a level of sanity to go along with that, maintain a level of health, and still come up with healthy notions of being, healthy notions of success, healthy notions of raising my own children, you know.
Because I never observed you. I don't observe you as someone who's capitulating to the current, to the wave.
Right.
You know.
So here's my more recent understanding, and Sylvia Winter has helped me do this. If I do not operate based on the Western view or definition of what it means to be human, where do I pull my understanding of what it means to be human? Now, let's say in the process of developing that, until I get there, I want nothing to do. If your definition of humanity is based on what we know in the social structure or in the mainstream, I want nothing. I didn't create a different language because I want nothing to do with that. The older you get, the more withdrawn you get. You know elders that I'm beginning to understand now why they pull back, and exist more in solitude. So my argument sounds more like a colorblind argument on the surface. What I'm saying is, at what point do we elevate beyond the concept of race? Not the concept of blackness or concept of, because to me, I use an Africanist. And I even understand that for many, and I learned this from a lot of contemporary African artists, the concept of African art is a European concept. Again, if we're talking about the definition of art and what art is, Europe created this concept, African art, right? So you have some contemporary African artists that's on the ball. They killing it. And they understand, it's a book called The Culture Game by Olu Agwibe, right? And he talks about some artists like Yinka Shonibare, who on the surface, it looks like they are just a part of the system. You know what I mean? Or we're one of the ones cherry picked by the art elite. But if you do a deeper dive into their work, and this is some of the stuff I'm trying to do in my work, you see a totally different way of understanding not just the role of artists or what the capabilities are through one's artwork. Similar to Burt Williams, George Walker, those early black minstrel performers who, while performing to a segregated audience, was actually doing two performances at once. You know what I mean? And that was over 100 years ago. That reality still exists. Now, I don't know if that answers the question, but,
Yeah, so that leads me, and I think this one relates to what we were just talking about. Because we're in a capital-intensive society or capitalist society, capital-intensive industry, and all different kinds of art in that regard, in terms of it being capital-intensive. And you mentioned very early on just the impact of, people are making art in a capitalist context. It can impact the kinds of things that people produce. And, we're talking about, Black arts movement, Black art, being a Black artist committed to Black liberation in a context where a lot of art is consumed by majority white audience, like mainstream audiences are, majority white. And again, as a parallel to, doing political work, that's a reality that folks, I think, is a challenging thing to navigate, and to be effective in doing so. Because one of the things you actually just mentioned, there are a lot of elders that that kind of withdraw. Mm-hmm. And I know for us, when we think about like LBS, we have to, because of our political work, we're engaging the systems, but trying to engaging them on terms that are based on Black liberation. Yeah. But there's still work that we got to do in navigating, a lot of these systems that are white controlled and dominated. And so I guess it's very similar to the last question, but specifically about like the way that art is consumed, the way that Black art is consumed by white audiences, and the impact that has on artists that are seeking to engage the question of Black liberation. If you could talk about, and you already done some of this, like some of the ways that it impacts you, and then some of the ways that you see it impact other artists that are attempting to engage in a Black liberation politic in a context where it's a majority white mainstream audience.
Traditionally, I have sought to always add historical cultural context to my work. Historical and cultural context. That's also a part of me being an educator. Like, I'm creating this work for a reason, for this reason, to bring attention to expose. Again, more often than not, even subconsciously or non-consciously, I'm in dialogue with my students, right? Baltimore City Public Schools mostly, or with much younger people. And my dialogue is based on the reality of what goes on in my classroom. So many young students, I'm talking about 14, 15, 16, 17, 18-year-olds, have no understanding or clue of what it means to be Black, even on a surface level, right? What it means to be on a surface. Like, there's a little consciousness, any type of social, political, cultural, that's not how they move. So what I try to do with my work is expose some type of historical and cultural context. And I get that straight from Asa Hilliard, right? As an educator, if I'm going to help a young person go from being a mere creature of habit to being more, or elevating from a spiritual perspective, because I think teaching and learning is a spiritual endeavor, then I have to give them context. Why are you sitting in my classroom? Why are you here, right? So I attempt to do that in my work, add some type of historical context. The hard part, though, is how does that shape their current reality? Like, what impact does that have on their current reality? There are artists, and I'll name a few, Derek Adams, for example, who is creating work. It took me a couple years to get it. I'm not going to, because my work is in your face. I may have a portrait of George Stinney Jr., first person, or the youngest person ever to be executed by the state, 1944, South Carolina, right? Falsely accused, snatched from his home, parents weren't there, never saw his parents again, fast trial, make a long story short, was so small they had to sit him on a stack of Bibles in order to be electrocuted, right? I may have a portrait of him next to a portrait of one of my students in the same exhibition, intentionally of the same age group, intentionally to show that this young brother may not have the opportunity in 2022 to reach his full potential in a similar way that George Stinney in 1944 You know what I mean? Never even saw his family again, right? You know, but there are still some similarities there. That's, again, that cultural and historic context. I mentioned Derek Adams. Derek Adams creates work with people who can be defined as black in a leisurely, in a swimming pool, things of that nature, right? It took me a minute to understand what he was doing. What he's doing is actually brilliant. Though it may not be revolutionary, it's liberatory, right? And we can argue back and forth. But it's liberatory in the sense that I don't think his audience, even though his work may be consumed by a larger Euro-American or European audience, I don't think his message is directed toward them. His message is, let me illustrate that black folks, or what it means to be black, is not simply about struggle. Now, we can argue for or against, right? But if my work that I do wishes to illustrate a more complete picture, then that's a part of it. That's not how I choose to depict the black experience, but that's a part of it. And I had to learn to come to accept that. That's an artist, and he's close to my age. There are much younger artists. Jarrell Gibbs, for an example. I've even heard him say, hey, look, I want my daughter to understand and know the historical context, but I don't want her to live as if she feels like her race is a burden. Now, those are my words. That's how I interpret it. Initially, when I heard that, I had an issue with that because that seemed like escapism to me. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. But then, once I began to understand Derek Adams' work, I developed a deeper understanding for Jarrell Gibbs' work. And there are others, right? Bottom line is, when we're talking about black art and black artists, we are just a reflection of our communities. That statement, we're not a monolith, that's a loaded statement, right? Because I think some people use that as a means to, as an excuse.
Or to counter the politics.
To counter the politics, exactly. I know that's not where I'm coming from, right? I only say that to say that there are multiple ways we can attack this thing. The way I choose to attack it is historical, mostly historical, right? Others may not do that. But yeah, that's kind of pretty much. Like Amy Sherrill does a certain thing. Now, mind you, all the artists I name, Stephen Towns, they may or may not be from Baltimore, but they cut their teeth here. Because I like to say that Baltimore in and of itself as a city has a certain energy, a certain vibe, a certain spirit that actually fosters a certain politic. Again, if your goal is for your work to be consumed by a mostly white audience or to be accepted or validated, that's the word, to be validated. Because some people see validation in sales, right? Some people see validation in acquisitions, right? Who's acquired your work, what collectors. Other people see validation simply in attention. Some people see validation in the actual relationship you develop with your audience, your intended audience, and then anything outside of that. I'm more of what relationship do I have with my audience, right? What role does my audience play in my generating of ideas and in my creating of images, right? What role, So, and let's be clear, black cultural production has always been sought after as some semblance of entertainment or to create a better quality of life for white folk since we've been here.
So let me ask a question. This is kind of a follow up to this last question. Let's say you're talking to an artist and they want to they articulate that they want to be more successful, right? And a part of what they kind of instinctually understand is, to your point you just made, I got to do things that are validated, right, by those major institutions. But this person feels like torn about that. what kind of advice or conversation would you have with somebody to say to them, for them to make the kind of choice that you've made, for what would you say to them to say as to the value of the choice that you've made in terms of your commitment to your politics and your art?
Well, I first like to say I'm blessed to have people in front of me, family, blood relatives, and otherwise, mentors that I respect, that I know, teachers that I know. I mentioned James Phillips, Sorrell's Adewale, Michael Platt, who's no longer with us, Joyce Scott. You know what I mean? People who, Roy Cross, who's no longer with us, Pontella Mason, who's no longer with us, who I seek their approval. They're my elders, right? So one, they put the work in, right? So first, like, I don't honor them simply because they are older. They actually earned my respect in the work that they've done. So because I have that, which is somewhat African-centered, because I have that, my work is not just, even though my dialogue and my work is mostly with young people, I seek to honor those that came before me and created a space and place where I can do what I do, right? Or at least give me the knowledge, wisdom, and understanding that my work is not for my own self-aggrandizement, mainly, right? So because I can't just say, oh, because this was Ernest, this is what Ernest does. No, I have some very good teachers and mentors, right? So because I have that, it allows me to develop a mindset to say, I don't chase money. You know what I mean? Not that I don't understand the importance of that within this given system, right. But I never, ever chased money. And by money, I'm not just talking about currency. I didn't chase that. I didn't. So what I would say to that young artist, always maintain your integrity. No matter what you do, maintain your integrity. I've slightly changed that in, first, make sure you develop a legitimate definition of integrity, right? Because you just can't say that to young people. They got to know and understand what integrity means, right? And in order to do that, you have to have some of what I had. You got to have people around you to help you understand what it means to be humble, what it means to be loyal, what integrity means, what it means to be a member of a larger group of people or see yourself in that context, what it means to study, right? All those things. So my first thing is develop an understanding of integrity and never do anything that goes against that, right? To the best of your ability. That's the main advice I would give them, right? Sonia Sanchez gave me some advice once. I met her in my early 20s, and I was just all over the place, right? Had flunked out of school, you know what I mean? I just had not yet got back on track. I was lucky to be somewhere. It was at UMBC. So I was lucky to get to speak with her briefly. And I just asked, where do you get your inspiration? Like, and you talk about Black Arts Movement. Right. She in the mix. Right. She said, your inspiration is all around you. Just go outside and walk around. Where do you live? I said, West Baltimore. Just, and shift your mindset and be open to everything you've ever experienced, your surroundings in more ways than just, here's where I live. These things help me develop an understanding of what it means to be. I keep going back to that in ways that's different from social structure, than different from Main Street society. Like, that's what the Black Arts Movement was about. We have ways of knowing and being that are not consistent with what we've been taught. Another reason why I'm still in Baltimore City Public School. Might not be there for many more Mondays, but I'm still there because in that classroom, when they walk in, everything they see is, I say 95% of what they see is centered or all images of Black folk, right? Not just visual artists, but images of Black folk and Black art. Like, I bombard them with images that combat the images that they are consumed with on a daily basis, right? I combat that. And I'm constantly attempting to undo what's happening in their other classrooms in the very same building. Sometimes unbeknownst to my colleagues. So I'm not here to beat up on my colleagues, right? They products of the same system I'm a product of, well, similar system that I'm a product of. But so I'm seeking to undo while simultaneously, and maybe 4 other classes that day, anti-blackness, anti-Africanness, all of that. But my advice to younger artists, I can't tell them not to chase money. All I can do is live in a way where I'm an example or can potentially be an example for them the way I had those examples of folks for me.
Well, look, man, I appreciate you coming on, man. This is a pleasure, man. Appreciate it.
Man, I apologize. You asked some great questions.
Yeah.
And sometimes
I think
good. Like my laptop got many windows open.
Yeah.
So, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
But no, I appreciate you, brother.
Yes,
sir. I've known you for a while now.
Yeah.
And whenever I know I need to get back to my studying, I text you, say what books you read.
Yes, sir.
You know what I mean?
Yes, sir.
But yeah, I appreciate it.
All right, man. Appreciate it.
All right.
All right.